Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on the latest episode of Rod and Ring, Ancient Near East meets Modern West. I'm your host, Samuel David, and today's special guest is academic, occultist, writer, and educator. I'm sure that he's got more qualifications that I've clearly overlooked. Chris Cogger is joining me today. Thank you so much for coming on the show and being willing to share your vast knowledge and expertise.
Absolutely. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
The goal of this channel, as you know, as many viewers and followers already know, is largely focused on the esoteric aspect when it comes to the study of the ancient Near East and its modern application. However, the important thing that I also want to highlight is, of course, the focus on the academic side of things. That way, we can ensure that a spiritual practice is well informed, that an occult practice is informed, that those cultural context clues are front and center when we're interpreting the practices of these ancient peoples from which we derive or potentially may derive our practices from. So,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, because the first thing you said there, well, one of the things I think is really important to pick up on, I think is maybe a good opener to sort of frame this conversation, is you talk about how occult practice or also esotericism needs to be well informed. And it's part of a wider, at least, being in teaching, engaging on social media with sort of esotericism in the past sort of 3 years I have. It's an interesting kind of debate that we end up having over really what people want their esoteric practice to be, and you kind of have the two big main camps over whether you're going to be a revivalist or a reconstructionist. So whether it's more important to you to engage with rituals and pantheons and things that are related to your direct ancestors and do it in the way that they did it back then. If that's what's meaningful to you, that's certainly an option. Or do you feel more of a sort of a kinship with being able to revive those traditions, and put them into a modern context? And it comes down ultimately to what I think people are after when they're sort of doing their esoteric practice, essentially. And I think it's one of those interesting, weird questions that at least I don't see a lot of modern practitioners asking themselves. They kind of jump headfirst into grimoires, they jump into ancient magical systems, whatever it is, without taking that kind of reflexive time. First of all, to say, what do I actually want out of a practice? If you situate it within kind of a social value model, so if I'm going down like sociology routes, whatever, in terms of what you personally think is valuable, right, and what is valuable to you as an individual, as a practitioner, if those two identities are the same thing, because some people they aren't, right? Their occult identity and their esoteric identity is one thing that works especially well for. It's a distinctly kind of American way of talking about it, and
most definitely,
because part of it, a lot of the way ancestry is talked about in America versus in Europe is very, very different. Mostly because the majority of the American population are colonists, right? They're very different conversations.
The big dirty C word.
Yeah. And so there's often this kind of interesting sort of backtracking, and it's really weird, coming from someone from Britain, from the UK. It is very, very strange to hear Americans sort of go, oh, well, I'm a quarter Irish. My 1/8% grandfather, whatever, was Irish or Scottish or something, and therefore I connect to that entire culture. It's like, well, for starters, you're assuming on the one hand that it's purely blood ancestry that connects you to a culture, and you're not sort of thinking about things like affinity ancestors and other kinds of ancestral traditions that you're connecting with. And that also kind of, in general, it's a much more kind of broader Western way of thinking about connections to the past and how you think about cultural heritage. And it informs everything, right? But I think what people are looking for when they come to esotericism all the time is this kind of, trans-rational experience of the divine or whatever, that there is some kind of long-lost history that you're going to connect to with God or something, or the gods or whatever it is. And they sort of approach their practice with this interesting set of kind of assumptions and presumptions a lot of the time. And when you actually try and situate those things in history, it kind of strips it away. And it's the same problem that religion has, right? It's the same problem that, as coming from an archaeological background, if you try and situate pantheons and mythologies and things, you can't separate them from political or economic renovations and things like that, right?
Right.
Religion reflects political changes and economic changes.
And in
So
many cases, religious cultures or religious customs, the iterations of cultic worship, those are all intrinsically linked to politics, to cultural identity, to, you know, whoever is actually ruling the nation or the people, or, you know, overseeing the management of any particular settlement or people group.
yeah, and it goes the other way as well, right? So it goes the other way on the level for the people. So engaging in certain forms of worship or elevating certain deities as opposed to other deities is inherently a political motivation, right? So it can be a means of resistance and reform, especially if you're sort of fighting back against oppressive regimes, whatever. Um, you know, there is a lot of interesting discussion I'm seeing sort of coming out of areas of the Middle East right now in terms of the Levantine areas, the Jordan areas, those kind of places, where there is an increasing, you know, the tone or tenure of paganism in those areas is increasingly returning to Canaanite polytheism. There's a lot of interesting kind of new work being done on sort of reviving sort of pagan conceptions, sort of pre-Israelite theology, you know, it's sort of pre-Yahwism. And that was sort of an area of that I was interested in. My undergraduate thesis was on sort of indigenous Levantine religion, right? So I was working in the southern Levant. I did 3 seasons of excavation in the region around Golan. So it's sort of just southern Golan Heights. It's sort of the northern Jezreel Valley in what is today politically occupied by Israel. But there's some various other sort of things going on. But you know, so that kind of area, and I did 3 seasons of excavation there. And it's really interesting. It's fascinating talking to people in these kind of areas, you know, especially ones that are of rural persuasions. It is an interestingly very rural thing. You know, people who are living outside of the central cities are increasingly turning towards more sort of Canaanite polytheism. And it's fascinating to see, right? And it's interesting to see how they conceptualize their past, how they conceptualize heritage, and different notions of how things like intangible heritage are being decimated right now, which is a major challenge, right? But yeah, there's a lot of different directions with it. You know, it's an interesting kind of idea, but there's a lot of different ways you can go a lot of the time.
So, what was the driving factor that compelled you to pursue this field of study?
You know, if you were asking that question, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, you know, I would have sort of given the typical materialist answer and sort of gone, oh well, I love archaeological sites, I love excavation, I love, you know, religion, I love mythology, I love all this kind of thing, and it's great to kind of be on the ground, you know, at ground zero. If you're the one doing an excavation, you're the first one with boots on the ground in a temple, you know, or a tomb or anything like that, and that comes with its own emotional things. You know, it's very interesting to kind of be there. If you're the first person in 1,000 years, 5,000 years to pick up an artifact or an object out of the ground, that carries its own weight, its own importance to it. Now, especially in the past year, as I've kind of been studying heritage and working with heritage agencies, it's my opinion on what exactly archaeology is and what our role is in society, or what the role of the archaeologist is in society, has changed quite radically in the sense of, well, it's becoming increasingly more political, but I'm interested now in a lot more of sort of the assumptions of value, and understanding what we value in society, and why people preserve the past, and the things that sort of, well, value judgments and sociological judgments that created archaeology as a field, and why archaeology is the way it is, and also the way it interacts with the public as well. So what is the actual role of archaeologists and historians and things in society? It's related to kind of a wider discussion of really what's the point of preserving history. I think it's kind of like the thing that's in the back of my mind right now that I'm always sort of coming back to, and it's an ever open question. You know, so why should we preserve archaeological sites? What's the point in preserving history at all? And the answer to that question comes down to different value systems. So what
Right.
people value and why they value it, different ways of valuing, and where those ideas come from, and how they're situated in kind of a historical tradition. And it's like I'm increasingly just becoming more interested in philosophy a lot of the time, like the philosophy and the assumption behind why we think the way we do, you know, especially when it comes to thinking about sort of philosophies of science, you know, and the because it's been a big thing since the 60s and 70s, there were various movements in archaeological theory about reforming archaeology along the lines of the natural sciences. It's a movement called processualist theory, because archaeology moved away from focusing on cultures to focusing on sort of systemic processes and trying to find essentially sort of what is, if you think sort of physics and chemistry, you think of universal laws, right? So law of gravity, whatever. There was this movement in sort of the 60s and 70s that argued that there was, as archaeologists, we should be trying to find universal laws for human nature. Whether that's actually possible in any manner of speaking. So it was a way of archaeologists trying to retrain and sort of redefine the epistemology of the entire discipline. To really just like they refine it to try and make archaeology more of a sort of a processualist or a positivist science. Because they were arguing, it was part of the whole debate over whether science can truly be objective. And at this point, I'm of the opinion, I sort of skirt and reflect between, on the one hand, we can use objective methods, we can use scientific methods, whether it's carbon dating, whether it's dendrochronology, whatever it is. But when it comes to interpreting history, like putting the facts together, you can't do that independent of theory, right? No fact exists independent of theory, which is a controversial statement in itself, right? But I'm from that kind of, I'm of that generation of academics that is sort of post-structuralist, post-processualist. So things like phenomenology exist in my vocabulary, and interpretive archaeology, or sort of Ian Hodder type stuff is sort of my theoretical background, so it's very different. And that also kind of it bleeds into esoteric practice hugely, because esotericism is, I think one of the great values of esotericism. There's a lot of discussion around hermeneutics, right? The sort of the science and philosophy of interpretation, and how you interpret certain things, and what frameworks and lenses and things you're looking at sometimes. And a lot of the hermeneutic training that I've had in archaeological training has affected everything I do esoterically, right? Because the assumption with something like processualist archaeology is that meaning is fixed in certain objects.
Right.
So there is an objective archaeological record, and there is kind of this underlying assumption that history is kind of all the property of archaeologists all of a sudden, which is really strange, and it was very popular. It was a very popular view in the 60s or 70s that because archaeologists are objective scientists, like that's actually a thing at all. Suddenly, our data set, our database, essentially, is the archaeological record, which is the material remains of past cultures, past histories. And because we're processual archaeologists are looking for kind of systemic behaviors, they're looking for generalizing patterns, which is the model for general positivist science. They kind of used it to broaden the scope of archaeology to say, well, we're looking for human laws, so therefore, archaeology is the property of all human history, and therefore we are the custodians of human history.
Right.
That obviously falls apart when you realize that in post-industrial world, so post-1700s, everything has become so institutionalized and so sort of commercialized, apparently, that when you actually look at how we engage with history, and this isn't just in archaeology, I think it's just societally in general, and this also works to a certain extent. I guess it's also true for esotericism, but the way we frame and interpret pretty much everything we think about is via its consumptive value, right? So if something is valuable to us only in the sense of how we can consume it, so how it's used by us, and that is, capitalist, various instances of that kind of thing. But the problem you have with that, especially if you're asserting that within a positivist paradigm, right, sort of all like a logical positivism paradigm, is it essentially mean you strip archaeological sites, temples, other culturally significant places of any kind of other value outside of a scientific paradigm. So you're essentially, so if you sort of approach it with pure epistemology or sort of objective epistemology, you essentially say that a site or something can't have any other kind of value, whether it's social value, historical value, outside of value for research purposes, and then that inherently, especially when archaeologists are the ones who are creating heritage legislation, that it excludes tons of other communities, right? Indigenous communities, other voices, people who find it. People have different value models, right? Because values are essentially socially constructed, right? Which means that there are, in any given archaeological situation, especially if you're dealing with ones that are temple sites, right? So religious sites, especially, which are also political. There is no sort of definitive way of saying whose values are worth more or less, right? Everyone, like, because like value in terms of morality, it's inherently an amoral thing. It exists outside of morality as a judgment scheme. You can't say, like, and this is a problem that science has always had, right? Science can't make judgments on ethical and moral things, right?
Right.
Because they can't be generalized, right? So I can make tons of advancements materially, but I can't say whether a scientist working in New York for American democracies is doing anything better or worse than a scientist working in Nazi Germany, right? I
Mhm.
can't make that I can't make that moral judgment. Scientists just can't do that. And it's part of the problem that we kind of have in terms of how we're relating to different value structures, because different groups of people have different value structures and all of them are equally valid. And yet also at the same time, none of them are valid. You know, that's the kind of like weird middle line that you have to tread, because it's all socially constructed. But
Right. What are some of the challenges that you faced in your field of study as someone who is in the British education system, the higher institution, in interacting with individuals in local regions where archaeological dig sites are ongoing?
yeah, it's an interesting debate because you know the in a way we in Britain at least and parts of Europe, but Britain especially, we have no indigenous population
Right.
really, not anymore, right? Like I mean, oh, actually again, it depends who you ask. If you ask the Welsh will tell you that the Anglo-Saxon migrations kicked out all the indigenous Britons, right? So all the and there was a study published in a genetics journal I think last month. That made a fairly convincing argument that the number is something like 73, 75% of the modern English population are Anglo-Saxon descended, right? So they're European migrants essentially. So for the most part, there is no indigenous community in Britain, right? And this becomes a kind of weird nationalistic tone when you understand that, like, you know, the people who built Stonehenge, for example, have no direct ancestral relation to modern Britain.
Right.
Right, they are, you know, for the most part, LDK, so linear bank ceramic or early Neolithic populations, who have no relation whatsoever to modern Britain. So Stonehenge isn't really a British monument because the people that built it aren't living in Britain anymore, you know. But it still has value over different generations to different people, right?
Mhm.
So that's different. So it's become symbolic of British identity, but it's not really British. And
Right.
I mean that's also true for other aspects of British culture, right? So if you and one of my friends at undergraduate did her thesis on this sort of like the construction of British identity. You know, like if you ask, especially teenagers, um, who are, you know, going out to drink when they're going out in the major cities or whatever, what it means to be British, they'll usually tell you like any kind of mixture of pubs, kebabs, Chinese food, pizza. You know, it's like none of which are British, right? And yet somehow those things have become synonymous with British culture.
Right.
And it's all about how you kind of, you know, how different things move around. Um, so like in a way, you know, in terms of challenges I face, you know, in a way it's easier being in Britain because there is no indigenous population to contend with, right? There is no kind of lobbying that has to be done, or there is no kind of ethical concerns around who owns what. If you go over to a place like America, very, very different, and obviously
Yes.
Australia as well, right? So
Yeah.
America and Australia are kind of at the forefront or the avant-garde of sort of new archaeologies right now. I think the biggest and most atrocious one that I've seen in my career, at least, it wasn't something I was directly involved with, but it was a case study that one of my lecturers was involved with that we had to kind of critique. Um, was in I won't name the museum, but there was a museum in America in the Southwest that was displaying native remains in a museum. And it turned out that the skeletal remain was a woman from, you know, 2, 3 generations ago, and the woman's great great granddaughter came and saw the remains in the
Hmm.
museum. Right. So like if you think about what that's like in terms of emotional impact, right? So if you don't know that your grandmother has been dug up, essentially, and you go to a museum and you see her remains on display, you know, that caused huge outcry, and rightfully so.
Yeah, as it
Uh,
should.
yeah, as it should. So it's an interesting kind of weird debate. A lot of the time. And in a way it's just as bad, if not slightly worse in Australia.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. So the first thing to understand about Australia and the relationship between sort of indigenous communities and Aborigines in Australia and archaeologists who are running sort of in professional universities, Australian Aborigines were only granted Australian citizenship in the late 1960s,
Right.
right? So sorry, it was 1967, I think it was. Australian Aborigines were granted Australian citizenship, which is atrocious in and of itself. But either way, that's the reality you're dealing with. Now, the archaeological situation in Australia is quite interesting because up and so it radically transformed, as most archaeology did in the 60s and 70s, because 60s and 70s was a major sort of time of innovation where archaeology kind of remodeled itself as a scientific discipline on the natural sciences. And up until really even the late 70s, actually, or might even be, well, late 60s, 70s, any archaeological artifact, whatever, in Australia was designated as Aboriginal relics. And that was kind of it. It was just kind of this big write-off word that nobody really, cared about too much. And of course, the problem you have is that the majority of heritage organizations and archaeological organizations that are making largely political decisions about Aboriginal relics are all run by archaeologists, and they're all run usually by Western immigrants as well. And that is slightly changing. It is starting to change. There have been, especially in sort of the late 2010s, there have been, especially at universities, there are increasingly kind of programs to involve Indigenous communities in the crafting of research aims as well. So you actually are involving living descendants of those communities in sort of forming which questions you ask about the relationship of things, right? Which is great. But it was partly, the situation from the 60s, it was this kind of assertion, because like a lot of the theory that is used in archaeology in Australia it was imported from the US, right? So sort of this whole new wave of archaeology theory, of archaeology being a science, comes out of people like Lewis Binford, who was working in the 60s in the US, or 60s, 70s, 80s in the US. And a lot of that processual theory is imported to Australia in the 60s and 70s, along with academics and universal professional archaeologists who are coming from mainly UK universities over to Australia. And they're responding. It goes back to that question of objectivity and neutrality in science, and whether science can be neutral. Now, there are tons of debates around it, and to a certain extent, I don't think it can anymore. The way I'm thinking, I think I'm part of that constructivist or social constructivist school. So I think science and the values that we talk about and things like what's considered acceptable paradigms for research are socially constructed. So it's its own thing. But you have, all of these people coming across, and new archaeology tried to present itself as this sort of neutral science. And to a certain extent, you can kind of, they definitely tried to make the argument, but then what the government decides to do with that information is entirely another thing, right? And this is sometimes where sort of wires get crossed a lot of the time. Archaeologists may be responsible for helping the government make legislation and consult as experts or whatever, and the sort of the institution of the expert is its own kind of consequence of industrialization as well. But archaeologists may be helping to create these policies or whatever. It's still the government that implements them. And it's the government, in a way, can weaponize archaeology in a nationalistic sense.
Absolutely.
Right? There's tons of other conversations we can get into about this. But as it pertains to Australia, the government, one of the things that they often do is they have come under fire and sort of scrutiny in this in recent years, but especially in the 60s and 70s, this was really a problem. The government can use archaeology to, in a way, kind of depoliticize situations. Right. So Indigenous communities, for example, if there are remains buried on land, or there are certain pottery styles or certain fabrics or anything like that, they can use archaeological material to make claims for land. And the government, by calling in archaeologists and making legislation for certain things, they can depoliticize those claims and in a way dehumanize them.
Absolutely. Right? And we see this a lot throughout.
Yeah. It's a whole thing, and the whole kind of working theory behind it, again, is in the mind of processual archaeology. You are looking for sort of universal laws, universal systems of how humanity, how culture evolves. And by kind of expanding and universalizing those systems, you kind of strip private ownership of artifacts and you make it a public humanity thing, right? So when you have systems and materials and remains and you're studying them in a research paradigm, it's no longer about political messages about who owns what land or anything. It's about finding universal human laws, so therefore all material suddenly belongs to all of humanity, which therefore politically can be used to justify you not giving land back, essentially. Right? So there are obviously dark things about it, and all this kind of thing. And then it's, it is changing, and that is something, it's something that we have to be aware of. A large thing I think is missing in a lot of the modern dialogue, or just in dialogue in general, is just an awareness of sort of the what informs value, right? Because there is this kind of assumption that archaeologists, as professional scientists, essentially, they have this kind of objective material record. It's part of wider debates and things that happen. So this is also part of things like the Anthropocene debate. So the Anthropocene is a really kind of interesting debate in geology, and it's essentially, we've gone through various geological epochs and different phases of time, whether it's the Pleistocene up to the Holocene, and then now there is kind of, it's been going around since the 80s and the 90s, I think. There's this idea that we are now in a new geological age, which is the Anthropocene, which is sort of the geological age is influenced by humans. So humans now are having an active role on shaping the climate and shaping the environment. So no longer is climate a purely natural thing. Human beings are, or a human being industrialization has the same capacity to alter the environment as, say, a landslide or a storm or a natural event. So in a way, human beings are their own natural event, right? And it's kind of this interesting debate over whether we're actually in it and whether human agency has actually gone as far enough to like permanently alter the environment. It's a big debate all the time. And when it comes to archaeology, what's really interesting is we have this kind of assumption that exists within a kind of historical framework that people aren't aware of, that we think, again, because we think archaeology is this objective science, that the material record that we're studying is inherently objective, and it's our data set, essentially. In reality, the choices we make in terms of what's included in the record, choices of making where to dig, all these kinds of excavations, choices about research questions, what kind of thing, it deliberately favors some aspects of the record, and it unfavors others, and it obscures others, right? So there's a lot of discussion, this is like first, second year archaeology theory that you learn in university, right? About site formation processes, about geology and all the kind of, weird, boring stuff that no one really likes. But you learn about that kind of stuff. But one of the things that you don't learn about very actively is the role of the archaeologists themselves in forming the site, in forming the material record, right? Our own interpretation of what is considered archaeological material and what's not, and then who we include and exclude by using that kind of language, is not something, at least in my undergraduate, that I was taught, right? It's coming in a little bit more now in masters and in grad school, and there could be an argument that, like, maybe an undergraduate just doesn't have the intellectual capacity to receive and have those kind of value discussions and those judgments, right? And that's something that's valid. I personally think it should be taught very early on, but that's its own thing. But there's just, it's a hugely interpretive thing, right? And you can't separate out. So this is sort of phenomenological stuff, but you can't separate out the subject, who's the observer, from the object, which is the archaeological record and the history that you're working with. And to a certain extent, that's also true of religion as well, right? So we're looking at religion, we're looking at mythological things. Esotericism is a prime example. If you take a kind of phenomenological approach to that, you can't separate out your sort of reception and how you're receiving data or information versus your place in it and how you are receiving the information, right? There's the information, and it's very kind of hermeneutics. Heidegger talks about it a lot, about this sort of process of what we call understanding, what understanding actually is. And a lot of it is grounded in a historical tradition, and we're not really consciously aware of that historical tradition as well, which is kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of the time it's this term and this concept of this thing that we call understanding, it's located within a tradition that we kind of credit with authority, right? And that is the historical tradition, essentially. But that inherently relates to the viewpoint of the person who's kind of talking about things. And if you're not aware of that, you're not aware of the social biases and the paradigms that come with it, of how you interpret certain things, right? So as an example, with esotericism, particularly, one of the things that is a growing problem, and it has been a growing problem since the dawn of the internet, but it's increasingly now so that we have algorithms on YouTube and Facebook and things, and YouTube and Facebook are the worst ones for this. But the amount of stuff that is, or at least in esotericism, that is either like heavily nationalistic or primarily Nazi, based in Nazism, or based in like Saddam Hussein's sort of Arab world nationalism. right? Especially if you're
Which is a
working with kind of
subject that
Middle
I'd
Eastern
like to
stuff.
touch on later.
That's another, yeah, we can get into that in a minute. This was like last we did like a funny experiment this last week. I was talking to one of my friends, and we were sort of having a conversation with our professor about sort of public engagement with archaeology. And we did like a fun sort of informal meta study on this, where if you go on YouTube and you type in pretty much more or less anything about religion, esotericism, anything like that, on average, and we sort of correlated this on like 3 or 4 different computers with like different groups of people. On average, if you go to YouTube and you type in something about mythology or esotericism, whatever it is, it takes about 4 clicks in terms of your suggested video that the algorithm is suggesting to you to reach something that is either not based in Nazism or based in like Iraqi nationalism, or is in some way funded by political organizations,
Yeah.
right? That have a stake in nationalism. So when you go to YouTube and you look at kind of, you have your main video and then like down the side you have your suggested videos. What we essentially found with sort of mirror analysis that we were doing is if you whatever you type in, whatever history thing you type in, if you're watching it, if you click through the suggested videos on average 4 times, 5 times, you will eventually reach something that has its roots in Nazism.
Yeah. 6 degrees from Nazism has been reduced to 4 degrees,
4 or 5.
degrees even.
Yeah, yeah. That's the general window, right? And a large part of the problem with that is, again, people are not conscious of where a lot of these ideas come from, and this is sort of one of my persistent gripes with a lot of sort of pop spirituality and New Age spirituality. The amount of New Age spirituality that is rooted in theosophy, which is, has very outdated ideas about race theory and all this kind of stuff, which is, disgusting.
These people have been dead for centuries, yet their theories, like Blavatsky, her theories are still gaining traction.
It's this whole thing, right? And it's I was having this conversation in my Discord recently, and there is other discussions around whether you can, it's an idea of sort of separating art from artist, whether because there's theosophists, some of them wrote okay stuff, at least spiritually speaking, it's half decent, except everything is filtered and sort of littered with these sprinklings of race theory and horrible sort of kindergarten Heinrich Himmler type stuff, So is it possible to separate those two out? Sometimes, for some people, no.
Sometimes no, because that's a subject that I've discussed in great detail with a friend of mine, and in many cases, especially when it comes to our early conceptions of the occult, the esoteric, and how it has related to the human experience, you can't separate the art from the artist because the artist's fingerprints are all over the art that they have created. It isn't so much a theory that has been presented that's gained traction. It's a theory that has gained traction with a specific culture of people who have then created a superstructure of power, who have used that same superstructure of power to marginalize other people that don't fall within the power structure.
Yeah. And again, a lot of people will often weaponize the past in order to do that, right? They will weaponize aspects of heritage, or they will weaponize certain aspects of an author's work and stress certain things and drop certain other things, right? Not to name any names, but you take one look at occult Facebook right now, and you look at the amount of debates and the amount of sort of vague posting and shitty comments and stuff that end up showing up on there. It's very easy to kind of like. It's incredibly easy to kind of see like what tribe someone comes from, like what school of thought someone comes from on there, which is really interesting for me to sort of think about, because it's a source of kind of perpetual amusement to me, where like people, the standard or the bar on like occult social media is generally sort of, people are posting hot takes and posting argumentative things, and people expect me to do that because I'm active on social media. And then they get perpetually disappointed when they friend me and find that I only share academic books and like pictures of my mum and my girlfriend, like it's my own thing. That's all I do on my social media. It's hilarious to me. I love it. It's just great. I love it. It's like a subtle form of trolling. Like I live for it. It's great. But yeah, it's fascinating, and if we were to look at essentially with Saddam Hussein, right? If you look at modern studies of or even just modern perceptions of Iraq, right, and you look at sort of the way the West perceives Iraq and the way we perceive Iraqi or Sumerian Mesopotamian polytheism, unless you're actively engaged in the scholarship of that region, all right, and you actively are working to dismantle where something's coming from, in the vast majority of the public's mind, the perception and sort of image of Iraq and Babylon in particular is the image that Saddam Hussein's regime puts out,
Yeah.
right? Like that, like people don't know the difference between like the history of like the actual like recognition of that kind of thing versus the version that he puts out in his regime. And that is unfortunately true for a lot of other situations. In general, it's the same with Nazism as well. You click down the Atlantis rabbit hole long enough and you get to real and all that kind of fun stuff, which is always very unfortunate, and the Aryan race and all that kind of thing. And to a certain extent, it's still popular, right? Because there are discussions nowadays about Indo-Europeans and Proto-Indo-European mythology and that kind of thing. The original name for Indo-Europeans was Aryans. Now we don't use that term because it's politically loaded.
Right.
And there's a bunch of there's interesting stuff there, and some people still do use it, and they use it for very specific reasons, but a lot of it is kind of historical revisions, which is its own challenge, and that's what happens in dictatorships, right? What happens in a lot of these kind of regimes, you actively kind of cultivate a perceived image of the past people then relate to, and that filters how they understand their religion. A lot of the time, it filters through how people do it. And it's inherently repressive a lot of the time, but there's an argument I think that can be made that by actively dismantling those power structures and looking into them, it's a way of kind of emancipation, right? So you remove yourself from the political sphere to the extent that you can, and you kind of look behind it, and you look at the evolution of certain gods and certain politics and certain things. That's what I've seen a few people, again, people who are in areas of Palestine, things like that right now. People who are obviously, as I said at the beginning, reverting back to kind of or thinking about Canaanite polytheism. There is a very interesting kind of movement that I've seen happening of people looking to kind of the pagan conception of Yahweh, rather than sort of the Second Temple Talmudic conception of God in the Israelite sense,
which is a fascinating field of study, because if you look at the belief structure and the diffusion of that time, there is so much material that people today, especially today, in terms of esotericism, polytheism, neo-paganism, it's incredibly enriching. And it's incredibly enriching. The challenge, though, is we take Yahweh or Adonai and view him specifically through the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian, or rather Christian lens, and everything else gets thrown out the window. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, for the most part, and to a certain extent, we are like the archaeology of the region is sometimes unfortunately follows a similar pattern. The hard-hitting underlying truth is that we are far too reliant on the Deuteronomy narrative, right? The Deuteronomistic narrative for our conception of Yahweh. And just in general, and the thing we have to understand, a lot of the early sort of Old Testament theology, it is actively shaped, actively formed, actively created by the prophetic tradition, right? It's the early prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. They are, even though a lot of the biblical stories are coming out of Judah, right? So the kingdom of Judah, it is an active, they are actively trying to form a theology out of it, right? And one of the biggest things that I've seen get erased, I think, in that conception, when people, because that's the only sort of frame of reference that people can have. The biggest thing that I've seen get erased with that is the regionality of Yahweh.
Absolutely.
Right? So how Yahweh is worshipped in different capacities in different regions, or even just that just saying that idea that there could be multiple forms of Yahweh is itself heretical. Right, because it's this sort of monolithic monotheism that has to happen until you look at the archaeological record and situated in history, and you realize that the monotheism or sort of Second Temple monotheism potentially didn't come about until the period of Maccabees, which is 2nd century.
Right.
So you have kind of Yahwism as a movement of worshiping Yahweh, one among many, but the active sort of fear and denial of other gods' existence probably doesn't it potentially only comes about very, very late in the 2nd century, which is incredibly late as far as religious are concerned. But as far as the early Israelites and the early sort of the early inhabitants, they are quite comfortable worshiping Yahweh in a henotheistic, sort of monotheist sense, where there's
Right.
multiple gods. It's fine, but you're worshiping one. And there are various elements of even the biblical tradition that attest to that. When you look at Yahweh, Yahweh is in general, he's a really weird god. It's the easiest way easy way I can explain it without being too political, because he's not Canaanite. He's an import deity to the Canaanite pantheon, but he's also not Israelite either, right? And again, there's a whole other discussion that is inherently political around the emergence of the Israelites and whether that's going on. There is, at least as far as, well, there was a historical group of people calling themselves Israelites. We can say that much. There is very little evidence to say that there was a kingdom of Israel that had its capital at Jerusalem, except maybe for a very, very short time under the reign of David, which people like Israel Finkelstein are also questioning. But it's the same question. But they, for the most part, what we now call sort of Iron Age and sort of Iron Age 1, Iron Age 2, biblical time period, let's say. They are the sort of the ethnic group there is made up of largely refugees from collapsing Canaanite city-states in the late Bronze Age. It's also probably made up of highland nomads, so Apiru, and that kind of people who are running around. And probably a large part are coming up from regions south of Judah and foothills south of Judah, so sort of northern Arabia and the Sinai and that kind of. And that is, for the most part, the generally agreed upon sort of origin area for Yahweh, right? The region of Midian, Edom, and Seir, which itself is kind of interesting. But Yahweh is a foreign god completely. He's not Israelite. He's not Canaanite. The general consensus is that he is, I say, existing, or he's probably existing as a local tribal deity, probably for the Seir nomads or sort of the Shashu nomads. And the Shashu are again a bit of a weird one because they're attested in I think it's Amenhotep III. In Soleb, he sort of writes a long list of various enemies that he's conquered, and he lists the Shashu of Yael as one of them. And then there's a later addition to that topographic list. Well, it's a topographic list rather than enemy list. There's a later addition by Ramesses II that comes in, which is an enemy one, list of enemies, and that conflates the Shashu, who are inherently like nomadic pastoralist groups in the Seir region, so Sinai, and it's the Shashu of Yael, but also he conflates them with the nomads existing and living in Seir, right, which is sort of northern Arabia kind of area. So there are interesting questions about the relationship between Yahweh and, say, Hosh or Chemosh, which is like the head Moabite god or the chief Moabite god. And there may be some, there are even some indications that there was heavy syncretism of them going on, which itself is quite interesting. Because then you have also the old theology around things like Asherah and the Queen of Heaven and that kind of fun stuff. There's the famous Pithos shards and inscriptions from Tel Aviv, which is the Yahweh and his Asherah thing. But the thing, like the part of, again, it becomes political, it becomes kind of sensational over religious. The thing that's missed on a lot of those Tel Aviv descriptions, yes, there is the Yahweh and his Asherah, and it occurs on Pithos jar A and Pithos jar B. That's the official designation. Very sophisticated, I know. But it appears on both of them, and yes, it does. If we're translating it right, it's Yahweh and his Asherah, and there are some issues around that kind of thing, especially if it's whether we're considering Asherah as a deity in that regard, or Asherah is it's a term for cultic object or temple.
Right.
Not entirely clear. It depends on how you render the Paleo-Hebrew and the suffix conjugation for the possessive. If it's his Asherah or if it's Yahweh and Asherah, it's still not entirely clear. And there is evidence for Asherah being worshipped as a deity even among the Israelites. But what's obscured in those inscriptions, because everyone sort of immediately focuses to, Asherah, Queen of Heaven, whatever, is the version that appears on inscription. The first inscription, so jar A, is Yahweh of Samaria, right? And Samaria is obviously the ancient capital of the Israelites. And this is kind of the problem that a lot of the narrative or the prophets in Deuteronomy have when they're trying to do all their affirmations. The capital of the kingdom, or at least the northern kingdom of Israel, is Samaria, right, which is destroyed in like the 700s. But the place of Adonai, the place of Yahweh, is Jerusalem.
Right.
right? And the challenge that we have with all that they clearly have is there are multiple conceptions of Yahweh floating around, right? So you kind of, like, hypothetically, he makes his way north, probably 10th century, 11th century. By the time he reaches sort of the Canaan area, there are varying competing conceptions of what he is, right? So the version that we have on Tel Ajud, there is a Yahweh of Samaria, but there's also a Yahweh of Teman as well. Teman is a Edomite tribe. It's one of the major Edomite tribes, and that also kind of support, because they're kicking around in the same area as the Shashu nomads. That also kind of supports that Yahweh is an Edomite deity, because he also appears on the Moabite stele as well, and
Yes.
that's it's echoing. I have it on. What's the note? It's Kings. Can't remember where it is now. Second Kings. Was it Second Kings 3:26? You have that narrative where Elijah kind of prophesies the battle against the Moabites, and the Israelites essentially get their ass handed to them because the Moabites sacrifice. I think the Moabite king sacrifices his son to the god Chemosh, and then Chemosh absolutely just devastates the Israelites in their battle, which is really interesting. And it's one of the key, like, not only is the Elijah as a prophet proven completely wrong, so what he prophesies doesn't come to pass, and Elijah is a very weird prophet anyway, but also, like, it's like a weird aspect that just cuts off, right? So like we suddenly hear this thing right at the end where the Moabites sacrifice, and there's another god who somehow overpowers Yahweh and all the Israelites, and then it just cuts off, and it just like starts a new chapter. They just forget about it.
Right.
It's like, are we gonna talk about that at all? Like, there's no commentary on this. Like, you prayed to your God, and your God just like got totally wasted. Like, we're not gonna mention that. Okay, fine. That's an interesting one. But there's a bunch of stuff with it, and it has, you know, essentially sort of cut a very long theoretical debate short. The general sort of working theory is that the capital of the kingdom of Israel is in Samaria, but the place of Yahweh is in Jerusalem. And what eventually ends up happening is the version of Yahweh that is being worshipped in Jerusalem seems to be closer to the pagan conception of Yahweh, to the Edomite conception. And that's the version that eventually kind of gets reformed into the Deuteronomy narrative.
Right.
And the Yahweh of Samaria gets kind of replaced by the Yahweh of Jerusalem, essentially, as he's adopted by sort of Israelite ruling classes. It's a fascinating case of syncretism, you know, all this kind of thing. Asherah is another weird one because she kind of comes and goes. She kind of dots around all the time. The primary way, like, we have a lot of evidence for her worship in Judah, so in the south. There's less, or much less, in the north, except by inscriptional evidence, right? And of course, the Deuteronomy narrative is talking about Asherah poles and Asherah cultic objects being worshipped in the north, and all that kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. But we have quite a large proportion of, like, Asherah figurines, or Asherah, what we call figurines, mostly in the region around what is Judah, so sort of southern Palestine, or like the northern Sinai, and that kind of area. And she seems primarily to be worshipped on the one hand as kind of the Queen of Heaven, and that's the conception that appears in the Ugaritic corpus, and the majority of the Deuteronomy narrative takes a hell of a lot from Ugarit as well, which is Bombay Shamra and area. If you look at any of the Psalms, a lot of this, in fact, a large portion of the Psalms, and even in places like in Numbers, also some elements of Judges as well. Some of them are even word for word copying prayers that are dedicated to. But it's also stuff like the stuff that's like seldom mentioned and not talked about very as much, because we talk about iconography. That's very common, right? The way Yahweh is presented in, I'll be respectful, I'll say Adonai. The way Adonai is presented in iconography is essentially Near Eastern weather god. Right? If you look at any kind of wind god or any kind of warrior deity, it's iconographically identical, right? There are various ones with horns and chariots and winds and all that kind of thing. So it's very simple. And again, like, even if you look at the mythologies and the stories, the spirit of Yahweh, when he's invoked, he is fundamentally a war deity, right? His spirit makes men better warriors. Samson, Gideon, David, you know, he's invoked before battle a lot of the time. And if you go back into, you know, the very early Iron Age, perhaps, and look at any of the lost book, you know, we have like the lost books of Yahweh, which are the wars of Yahweh, right? So and again, the two oldest sections of the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament at least, are both warband prophecies, right? They're both prophecies that are discussed, that are sort of uttered after a war or conflict. So the Song of Miriam and Song of Deborah, the Song of the Sea. They are sections of the Hebrew Bible that are so old that the Hebrew that they're writing in doesn't even have a definitive article. So there's no word for the in there, right? They are the oldest sections and they are warband. And interestingly as well, and Justin Sledge has talked about this, they're both uttered by women as well. And not women,
Yes.
but also mystic women, right? So women especially seem to have played quite an interesting role in prophecy and the legitimization of prophecy in Israelite, because we have these like what's her name? Oh, no, it's not Hosea. It'll come to me at some point. There's it's not Deborah, one of the other ones. I can't remember her name, but she legitimizes the prophecy essentially. And yeah, there's this instance of a biblical king actually taking a prophecy of a skull that's found to one of the women to legitimize and say, yeah, this is actually from Yahweh. You know, so there is this interesting role of mystic women in early Israelite society, which is quite interesting. And that, again, that's completely lost in sort of the Jewish mystic narrative in all the reforms and the revisions, which is quite unfortunate. But yeah, there seems to be an interesting thing. But the one that's also not talked about quite a lot, and this forms, again, also sort of influences a lot of modern esotericism through things like Freemasonry, is looking at like Solomon's Temple.
Yes.
Right? You look at Temple Mount, essentially. And what's, or at least what I think is really interesting with Solomon's Temple, bear in mind, it is currently forbidden. We're not allowed to dig on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Israeli political organization, the laws that they have, these laws, they are forbidding anyone to dig there for various political reasons. But so we can't really do any archaeology there because we're not allowed to dig. Period. So we don't know what it actually looks like, but based on descriptions that we have from mainly books of Book of Kings and things. What's really interesting with this is the design and the layout, at least architecturally, of Solomon's Temple. It's not unique in any manner of speaking.
No,
right?
absolutely not.
Like when you look at the style and the architecture of Solomon's Temple, it is essentially within the tradition of the Inantis broadroom temples that are very popular in Syria, and also at the same time just throughout the Levant became Phoenician and Tyre.
Right.
Right. It's modeled essentially almost identical to Syrian temples. So, for example, there's a temple of Ishtar. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's it might be the White Temple or something. It's Uruk or Ugarit or something like that. Or I can't remember, it might not be Ugarit. I think it's Uruk or someone like that. One of the temples of Ishtar. It's modeled exactly the same, right? So if you look at the architectural layout of Solomon's Temple, it's modeled off of Inantis styles and broadroom temples that are very popular in the Levant. The only difference is that they've got rid of the cultic niche. Right, yes. So the area that would have housed the statue originally is basically removed. They take it out and they sort of they fill in the back wall essentially, and they kind of have the cultic thing put forward. And part of that, on the reason for that is fairly obvious. There's it's sort of aniconism, right? You're not allowed to have images of Yahweh, at least by that point that the temple's made. And theoretically, that's where the Ark of the Covenant goes or whatever in the temple. But the thing with it, like the ramifications and the consequences of that are way, way deeper, right? Because if you think of the people who are actually building the temple, right? These are people who have come from surrounding Canaanite city-states. And there is no, as far as we can tell, at least when we look at kind of the population dynamics of each different site, there is no relation between certain forms of temple and certain population numbers or capitals and villages, right? The same style of temple is being built regardless of whether your village has 10 people or it has 1,000. Right, same style of temple. There is a uniform tradition of how we build temples to the gods across the Mesopotamia. Right, they know how to do it. Very simple. And because you have people who are from all of these areas who are building Solomon's Temple and building all this kind of thing, it is a kind of way of reinforcing that Canaanite heritage. So even though they are in the one breath trying to actively deny it and assert themselves through their covenant with God, I think on every other level of society, it's fundamentally Canaanite, and they can't escape it because it's the people. It's how they do things, right? So whether you're looking at burial customs, whether you're looking at marriage customs, architecture, religion, iconography, it's all fundamentally Canaanite, essentially. The primary difference is that what is essentially a vassal contract with God.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is when you look at the Israelite covenant with God, it is phrased in the manner of sort of Akkadian Mesopotamian vassal contracts, like between a king and city-state, right? The language that it's used, it's discussing it in terms of political alliances and war alliances, which is equally like also on point for Yahweh as a war god as
Yes,
well.
absolutely.
Makes sense, right? Which is kind of its own thing. So yeah, it's an interesting idea, and that is, credit where it's due. That is something that is entirely unique to that, like that culture. There, I can't think of any other instance where a culture makes like an actual proper vassal contract with their deity. The only one that I can think of is something like, if you look at the Assyrians, they're worshiping Ashur, and
Mhm.
that's like the national god Ashur, or maybe Marduk and things like that. But they're not making contracts; they're just
No,
national. So that's very different. So it's this fascinating, interesting thing. And a lot of that kind of pagan evolution of the system is completely lost because it's revised by Deuteronomy essentially. And that is in a way kind of what they wanted, right? They wanted to remove all that Canaanite heritage. So they have succeeded for the most part until you actually dig a bit deeper and you sort of scratch below the surface. And
speaking of warrior gods and
Mhm.
the mention of Ashur and Marduk and storms, and of course we hinted at the insanity that is or was Saddam Hussein in the 80s and the 90s. That reminds me of Desert Storm and the revival of Babylon in its modern conception in Iraq. And I was wondering if you'd like to entertain me and the viewers as we take a trip through Saddam's vision of Iraq as the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, which is
Yeah.
absolutely insane when you look at Islam as a culture and as a religion that essentially has overtaken Iraq. And you've got Saddam who is
Doing
proposing
dumb things. Yeah.
these taboo ideas and
Well, yeah. So this is kind of like the way we're phrasing it is kind of interesting, right? So the way you will kind of want to look at this, there are sort of two options we can go down, right? On the one hand, there is kind of the fervent Iraqi nationalism
Mhm.
that happens under Saddam Hussein, and on the other hand of it, on the other side of it rather, you have the fervent Islamic nationalism that happened under Islamic State in 2015,
Right.
right? And they are complete diametric opposites of how they handle the history,
Absolutely.
right? And that is, to me, as someone who is in heritage, absolutely fascinating, right? It's tragic and horrible for everything happened, but it's fascinating to go get an insight into what's going on. Yes, okay. So if we start with Saddam, yeah, Saddam, he's you know, as atrocious as he is, and as many people as his regime killed actually is, the man is like a walking meme whenever you read about him, right? He's absolutely insane. He's ridiculous, right? And what's even more ridiculous is when you look at his life, like there are assertions that he fled to Syria on a donkey. He married his first cousin. He gets awarded the keys to the city of Detroit at one point, which is, sure, why not? But also, yeah, the other one that I find absolutely hilarious, and the reasons will become apparent why. He got an award from UNESCO for his cultural reforms.
Yeah.
Right. So the very same sort of governing body that is intended to protect heritage and protect culture, they gave him an award for his services to education and Iraqi nationalism. It's like, and literally at the same time,
I'm inclined to think that he strong armed them, but that's just my pet theory.
yeah, it's also an equal source of amazement to me that Babylon only got UNESCO heritage in 2016, right? And there are, like, I have a feeling there are many political, perhaps even US reasons behind that, but
Yes, absolutely.
that's, I'm not officially allowed to say that.
And of
It's
course, the conspiracy theorists will assert that it's because the tomb of Gilgamesh was found,
oh
or
yeah,
the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar was found, or there's an Anunnaki Stargate,
yeah.
or one of any crazy thing that you can think of that comes on the History Channel now.
Yeah, whatever passes for the History Channel. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the best one with Sonar, I think, is the all the great ziggurats were actually Stargates, and that like he was investing so much of his money into like reforming them because he found some like secret alien technique or technology or whatever. It's great. I love it. It's also just weird, but
Which is
it's like,
funny because I happened to just be looking at a previous video that I did for this channel, and in the recommended videos there was a video about Saddam Hussein and the Anunnaki Stargate and how all of this money was being used to fund it. And I'm just thinking, yeah, this is the world that we live in. This is the world that you illustrated earlier.
Yeah, this is it. This is what happens, you know. Yeah, you again, you're always. I maintain it. You're always 4 or 5 clicks away from either Nazism or some kind of Saddam Hussein influenced thing, right? So it's just a reality. But yes, okay. So if we get into it, so yes, okay. So people, so if we try and sort of set a scene for people who are not familiar with this regime, so Saddam Hussein was ruling Iraq into the 80s and the 90s for the most part. Major dictator, and he really kind of uses a lot of archaeology. He uses a lot of Iraq's ancient heritage and connection to Nebuchadnezzar II to foster this kind of Arab world, or this sort of sentiment of a unified Arab world, essentially, right. Which is its own kind of interesting debate that we're still seeing political ramifications of today. But he does it in a weird way, and it's kind of like the archetypal example of dictators using archaeology for political reasons.
It's interesting because his ideal view of the Arab world, in the sense that it's essentially a pastiche of Mesopotamian iconography and cultural mores, it's almost in line with Hitler's view of the ideal Germanic identity. Germanic it's not even a Germanic identity. It's an Austrian identity that he has superimposed. Anyway, back to the subject.
No, you're totally right. Yeah, and in a way, so like the way, like the thing that I'm interested in from a historical perspective is whether we can whether we can say, or to what extent can we say, like, what was Saddam's conception of Nebuchadnezzar, and like how historically accurate how accurate was it? And the answer is not very much at all.
No.
But yeah, it's this kind of thing. So he does a bunch of things with Iraqi heritage, mainly because he's trying to, again, he's creating this interesting kind of unified Arab state, or at least his view of what the Arab state is, notably in that kind of unified pre-Islamic Arabian or sort of Arabic state that's centered around Uruk as the world's first city, all that kind of thing. He notably doesn't include the Kurds and the Assyrians in that regime of right, which he also equally uses because they are sort of the ancient enemies of Nebuchadnezzar, who may or may not be the reincarnation of. Well, it's also interesting. So he was very varied with it, and this is the thing. He was very politically minded with it. When you look at any of his political propaganda, whether it's posters, whether it's the coinage that he issues in Iraq, depending on what class of people he's talking to, he has a different image of who he is.
Yes.
Right? He's talking to business people, he's in a business attire, he's in an oil tycoon's setup, whatever. If he's talking to everyday people, he's presenting himself as this amazing sort of reincarnation of king. And he presents himself either directly, and this happened, like, we can see a kind of evolution of his thought along the line, because early on in his career, when he was first starting out, he presents himself as the successor, right? So he's very clear of saying, okay, I'm here to, reform the Arab world, sort of reform our supremacy. I am the successor to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I'm going to reform the Neo-Babylonian Empire, essentially. He also does the same thing with Saladin as well, but only really in literature, which is interesting, right? So like propaganda literature, he doesn't make as much use of Saladin in like physical coinage or so he talks about himself as Saladin in like literary pieces a lot more, which is kind of interesting. But he presents himself as the successor, and then as the regime sort of carries on and he gets more and more dictatorial power, he gets progressively more insane. And the more as he kind of goes through more and more, he continually starts to like reform himself more and more until eventually he culminates by saying, "Oh no, I'm actually just the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar."
Yeah.
Right. Like, fully, like it starts off as the successor, then he kind of goes down the road of saying, "Oh well, maybe my family might be descended from Nebuchadnezzar, so we're gonna, elevate this kind of thing." And then eventually he just goes full blown spiritual, goes, "I am the reincarnation of this," right? Which is interesting to kind of see the political reasons as to why he does it and how it kind of changes.
And then the next thing you know, he's got bricks incised with his name that are being used to build another ziggurat or restore.
Right. Well, yeah. So this is his reforms of Babylon, right? This is what he does. So he kind of so his perception of Nebuchadnezzar, which is really like what's really quite interesting is his perception of who and what Nebuchadnezzar is and what Nebuchadnezzar does is actually not rooted in anything Babylonian. the version of Nebuchadnezzar that he's using actually takes far more from the Hebrew Bible.
Yep.
So he's taking the perception that he has is as this kind of, like the way he paints Nebuchadnezzar is as this kind of tyrant, despotic dictator who ruled an iron fist the entire Arab state.
Yeah.
I think. And he was the greatest war leader that ever happened and the most powerful king, right?
He conquered the ancient world.
Right. And the irony with that is that that portrayal of Nebuchadnezzar is only really a thing in the Jewish narrative.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the archaeological narrative, he's far more remembered for being a builder and a politician than he is a powerful warrior. Because actually, one of the things that Saddam conveniently ignores is the early years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign that were a disaster. Right? If you look at sort of the early like the way Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power sort of goes, like he's working under his father, and he acquires a lot of kind of military warfare fame before he ascends to the throne.
Right.
But when he finally ascends to the throne, that first sort of the early years of his reign are terrible. It's plagued with like political revolutions. They're rebelling. He completely gets wrecked by Egypt. He never conquered Egypt. And he persistently tries to, but he continually keeps getting defeated until eventually he gives up. And then that, in a way, that sort of knock-on effect ends up happening, where because he can't take Egypt, all of the other Levantine states and tribes now see like the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonians, as weak. So they start revolting. So a lot of the early years of his reign are marred by trying to quell revolutions and political uprisings. So it's wrecked completely. And that is all conveniently ignored by Saddam, right? He only focuses on Nebuchadnezzar.
To his detriment.
Yes, right. And like all of the other like infrastructure building projects that he made, right? The construction of the Hanging Garden. I mean, that's kind of, he kind of stresses it for cultural reasons, but it's nowhere near stressed as much as the warfare stuff, right? The other aspect that is interestingly ignored is the political inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar himself, where he actively portrays himself as the good shepherd, the good king, working to better the lives of everybody in his region, which notably includes, at least later on, the Kurds and the Assyrians. Right. So even though they were initially enemies, Nebuchadnezzar, when he ascends to the throne, he understands that he needs to actually take care of them and to, actually treat them okay to prevent uprisings. That is completely ignored for the most part, right? Because Saddam wants to kind of justify it for their ethnic cleansing. So with all that in mind, him thinking that he is the reincarnation, and he does stuff like put coins into circulation where he's got his head on it, and behind it is sort of Nebuchadnezzar's. Or there are posters all over Baghdad on the walls that have him literally dressed in Nebuchadnezzar's armor, right? He's kind of presenting himself as the charioteer, essentially it's going to war with the West. Now, then he comes to Babylon, as we were saying, right? Now, the Babylon thing is so politically loaded. There's so much to it. Again, a part of it, which is really interesting, is partly Christian as well, right? Because the perception in, at least, well, not in his mind, but again, he was like, regardless of what we think of him, he was an excellent political strategist. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the effect that political and biblical propaganda would have on Western minds.
Absolutely, and it was around that time anyway, within the mid '80s to the late '80s. Even into the 90s, leading up to the turn of the millennium, there was a great deal of uncertainty, and there was this constant threat of not just imminent war, but also the return of Christ, which many still look forward to.
Yes, it's still a thing that hasn't changed in 2,000 years. But he's like, Saddam is fundamentally aware of the effect and the power of the biblical prophecies, right? Especially Revelation, because Revelation is kind of it's got America in a death grip even today, right? Prophecy of Revelation. And when you look at Revelation, Rome, or the way it's presented, Rome is kind of, not necessarily sacked, but debased by the whore of Babylon, essentially, right? And if you think of it from a political perspective, the West has, for the past 100 or the past few centuries, tried to set itself up perpetually as the heir to Greece and Rome. Right. And Rome is destroyed and kind of sacked by the whore of Babylon. It's desecrated, right? So Saddam is kind of seeing these ideas. He's going, okay, Babylon it has the power to take down Rome. And if Rome is the West, then I'm going to rebuild Babylon, right?
Well, you've certainly given us a masterclass, and I sincerely appreciate it.
Of
I'm
course.
definitely intent on having more academics on this channel because again, that is something in my not so humble opinion that the esoteric community is in desperate need of. So, as we wrap up this episode, what parting words of wisdom in 140 characters or less would you like to leave with our viewers and listeners?
I think the biggest one is like in a way doing a self audit, right? But do a self audit for what you value,
Mm,
right? So when you're whether it's approaching esoteric practice, whether it's how you approach history, um, whatever it is you're approaching, sit and ask yourself before you do it, like, what is it you're actually looking for here? Like, what is it? But also, like, examine your own value systems. Um, and that will undoubtedly lead you to like interesting contemplations around what's important for you to cultivate in an esoteric practice and a
absolutely.
spirituality, right? So because like I don't think there are often debates around whether you can be a scholar and a practitioner. At least historically speaking, there have been numerous no one like questioned Gershom Schollem's stuff when he was a Jew studying Kabbalah, right? No one could have batted like that, it's the kind of thing. It, you know, there are debates of whether it's emic or whatever, but I think as long as you are conscious of what biases you are bringing to the table and what things you want to be true, when you're doing this kind of research, I think as long as you're conscious of it, I
Mhm.
think that's something that's the first place you need to start, right? So as long as you're conscious of why you're constructing an esoteric practice, um, and the value that you place on certain things, and understanding that what we consider value, at least from a social perspective, is constructed within a historical like position.
Right.
Um, I don't want to turn everyone into kind of post-structuralists, kind of constructionists like I am at this point, but I'm always sort of questioning active power structures and how valid they are as kind of utilities for looking at this kind of stuff. And esotericism is no different, right? In a way, we actively create the esoteric record.